thank you for participating in History Makers. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Sharon Smaldino, and I hold an endowed chair position. I hold the LD and Ruth G. Mortgage Endowed Chair for Teacher Education, which is a little different than most IT. And I'm at Northern Illinois in the College of Education.
How many years have you been there?
This is my 10th year. Time flies when you're having too much fun.
What universities were you working with before that?
Prior to that, I spent a long time at Northern Iowa, University of Northern Iowa. And so it was kind of an interesting transition because I went from UNI to NIU, and I went from being S. Smaldino at one to Smaldino S at the other, and it got really kind of crazy in my emails and in trying to remember where I was. So everything is Northern whatever, and I go from there.
What is your primary focus of your work?
I have two venues that I'm really interested, but my primary responsibility right now tends to be in teacher education and looking at what we're doing in terms of preparation of educators, in terms of looking at how we're integrating or bringing the technology into the schools in ways in which we're changing education, hopefully, changing the way in which teachers are interacting not only with the technology but interacting with the children and the learning, and trying to see how the technology can be used in unique and really basically innovative ways.
Is that your primary area of research focus as well?
That, and my other area is looking at online learning or distance education. I'm really looking at how it is we go about structuring the learning environment. And I'm really right now focusing in on some of those decision processes that we go through as instructor designers. And what are some of the things that we're choosing to do as we design, and because we could do a variety of different kinds of things. How are we making these decisions to make these design decisions to implement online learning?
How did you get interested in the field?
It's a long story, but I've been around for a long time.
And we'd love to hear it. We would.
I actually have always been interested in how children interface with the materials. And for a long time, I started off in a totally different field, but when I was working with a group of deaf children, actually they were probably adolescents, and they had difficulty using regular classroom materials. The whole structure of their language system and what they understood and how they could read, how they could write, how they could communicate was not the same as the traditional child interfacing with these same materials. And so I felt like there was a real disconnect, not from the perspective that these kids weren't capable of doing this. They were very smart children. The problem was that the materials weren't right for them. And so my interest became one of how do you redesign materials to really meet the individual learning needs of these kids. So I started off in special ed. I was in special ed. I mean, I had a background in special ed, but I started off kind of teaching or taking courses in teaching in the context of special ed. And so I was working my way through coursework, and I reached that moment in your scheduled courses. I was a student at large. You reach that point where it's like, okay, you have to become a matriculating student. You have to get in a program. And it was like, I do? Why? I just want to keep taking courses. But the university had this policy that you couldn't just accumulate a bazillion hours. You actually had to get to be a matriculating student in a program. And I was looking through the catalog, and everybody thought I was going to go into special ed. And I went, no, I think I'm going to go up and talk to those media people. And they were like, why? And I said, because I think that's really where I'm interested. And just about that same time, the desktop computer came out. I'm that old. Just about that time, they had the desktop computers where you actually had floppy disks that were 8 inches and whatnot. But they came out, and it was like, okay, that looks to me like the perfect tool. And I was looking at this thing thinking, we really need to know how to use this. And we need to know how to use this in creative and innovative ways to help my students, who were these deaf kids. because I thought it was the perfect instructional tool. I thought you could make it do things. And at that point in time, the only way I could do that was to take programming languages. And so I learned to program in BASIC and Super BASIC and Pascal, and I learned a little assembly, but that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to be able to adapt the materials, adapt the programs to meet the needs of my students. And so I started really digging around deeper and deeper and deeper into this, and that's why I ended up in the field of IT. I mean, it just literally was because I wanted to meet the needs of these students. Now, I haven't worked with those students ever since, so I have no idea in the bigger picture whether or not this really did become an innovative tool for them, but I saw it in the context of an innovative tool for all students to learn. And so it didn't matter whether they were hearing impaired or whether they were language learners or whether they were, in fact, brilliant kids. This struck me as being the one thing that you could use across all venues, whether they have special needs or whether they are creative and innovative, and gifted. Somewhere in that continuum of kids, this was the thing you could use.
You mentioned distance education. Where did you get your interest in distance education? When did that happen? How did that come about?
That was a funny one too. I actually started off working with my little Apple IIe, and my husband and I decided that it might be kind of fun and funky if we could communicate with the family, because we were living quite a distance away from the rest of the family. So we bought a modem, a 300 baud rate modem, which today would be deemed to be slow. And we bought this. Nobody else in the family had one. So we had to kind of teach everybody how to do this. And I took the modem into the office one day and I said to the secretary, I want to do some email stuff. So the only line I could plug into, the only phone line I could plug into was her phone line, because it was the only one that was a type of phone line that I could actually connect my computer to. So it was rather amusing, because of course we didn't have computers in our offices, we didn't have Wi-Fi, we didn't have any of that at that point. I'm really that old. And so I would say, now, Lois, whatever you want to do, you just go and work and do your own thing, because guess what? I'm going to be using this for the next hour. And I actually started off doing the whole thing in email, and the first online course I ever taught was totally done by email.
A course by email?
Yes, the whole thing we did, all the students communicated with each other. I would send out my prompts for discussion, and then we would have all these reply alls, and we would have all these discussion, and the students hated it. Not because they didn't like the course and they didn't like the opportunity and the experience. What they hated was the fact that they would log in to their emails and have 60, 70, 80 new email messages, because there was all this interactivity and communication amongst and between. So it was kind of an interesting adventure. So I really wanted to get into more of how do you design courses to accommodate the needs of students from a variety of locations, and how do you design courses in the context of the tools and resources you have. It was a lot of fun, particularly because we didn't have course management tools, we didn't have those kinds of free-flowing types of things. The internet was, I had been teaching for several years before we actually got an internet, and the web was even further down the road from that. The whole idea of having a web-based interface was just a whole brand new thing. Yeah, I am that old, I guess.
That's a great story. It's a fascinating story. Can I ask another question about
Sure.
that? What is something that worked well about that approach, or was there something that worked well that some technique is still used today?
I think what worked well was I had to learn the economy of questions. I had to learn the economy of prompts. So that, because otherwise, if when I first started doing it at the beginning of the semester, I would put out a prompt, and then I would keep that discussion going by continuing to add prompts to the whole thing. And I had to learn how to make it economical, because, as I said, we were all logging on with 50, 60, 70 new email messages. daily, and it was crazy. So I had to learn how to post my prompt or submit my prompt or prepare it in such a way that it was economical for everyone to be able to then respond to it in a way that didn't lay out these horrendously huge number of emails. So, and that's something that I've tried to work with over time, learning how to pose questions or learning how to direct prompts in ways that make sense, and you're not putting a lot of time into people trying to figure out what it is you're trying to ask or coming up with minuscule answers that then you have to reprobe or you have to redirect so they come into deeper. So how do you put the prompt together to immediately engage them in the deep thought questions that you want them to be engaged in? So it was an interesting step forward for me to learn how to ask questions well.
Oh, well, that's a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that. Could you describe your career path?
Well, I think I sort of did, but I started off, I never, ever, 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 ever wanted to be a teacher. Never wanted to do that. In fact, I wanted to be an architect. But at the time, well, there were two variables that fell into place. At the time, architecture was not considered to be a woman's career path. I am really pretty old. What happened was that pretty much most women went into nursing or teaching, and my mother, who was a person who would have loved to have gone to college but didn't, wanted all of her daughters to go to college, but they didn't. So I was this child, and I was obligated to go to college. And I had a choice of one of two careers because those were the two careers my mother wanted. One was nursing, and the other one was teaching. Now, nursing totally turned me off. I mean, it was the whole thought of doing some of those things that nurses have to do was just not on my list of things to do. So I chose to go into education, but I didn't want to be a classroom teacher, so I chose to go into speech pathology. I'd still be in the schools, I'd still be working with children, but I wouldn't be doing it on a daily basis of the same normal grind. In my mind, it was the same normal grind. And here I am now in teacher education, working with pre-service teachers, going, I can't believe I'm doing this because I never wanted to be there to start with. But I got into it, and what I found was a world of working with children who had hearing losses. And I began to really look at learning from the perspective of how do we overcome this disability, this problem. How do we still engage these children in learning? Because they're not stupid, they just don't have this normal audio vehicle of the learning process. So how do I work forward into this? So I actually started getting into teaching, which was not where I was going to go in my initial phase of this. Okay, so I was in teaching and I was doing all of that stuff, and the last place in the world I ever wanted to do was go back to school after I got my bachelor's degree, and somehow I ended up in a master's program in elementary education, which was not where I wanted to go, except that it was the logical next step. So I did that. I taught school. We moved a lot as part of my husband's early career. And so I just kept moving around and getting new jobs and sort of reinventing myself in the field. And because I had this speech path background where I was an itinerant going from building to building to building, and I had this elementary degree where I taught children, I managed to sort of evolve it into becoming the itinerant deaf teacher who would go from building to building to building to work with kids individually or in small groups on their learning tasks and doing those kinds of things. So I went from there to ending up in a situation where I was working in a school for socially and emotionally disturbed youth. It was a residential school. So these were the kids who were the rejects of public school. And they were truly wonderful kids, even bigger challenges than my regular special population. They were now even huge challenges because in addition to having a hearing loss, they also had some social and emotional lack of performance. So I ended up going back to school to take courses and to learn about this stuff, and also to kind of learn about this technology stuff. And then I got talked into going to a doc program, and the rest is kind of history. from that point on. I ended up in working in an IT program, and that we had this service course for teachers and pre-service teachers, and I started teaching this course and going, okay, this works. And I kept saying to my colleagues, and I kept going down to the dean's office and saying, you know, this computer thingy is really a big deal, and we don't have them. And I can't teach these people to become good teachers without having these things. And so I was able to convince them to redirect funds, and we bought computers for the college, and we bought labs, and we had, you know, whatnot. And as laptops came out, I was back down in the office going, "Hi, it's me again," just being a little pissed. So I kept trying to explain that these are in order for us to prepare good teachers, we have to be doing the right thing. And so where I am now, it's kind of an interesting situation. It was a few AECTs ago. I was invited to apply for this endowed chair position in teacher education with the idea that I come in with this background of understanding or trying to understand learning and how do you facilitate learning in that process, but also that I advocate for using the tools and the resources that are appropriate to facilitate learning in any child. And so it was a natural fit for me, and I was able to segue into a different level of position. So I have a lot of fun in my current position because I can do what I want and how I want, and I can work with kids in the schools, and I can work with teacher education faculty. I can work with pre-service candidates. I can work with classroom teachers, and I can do lots of different things.
There's definitely a lot of breadth in the field.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, I can hear that in your stories as well. Thank you for sharing that. We've touched on this a little bit, but I'll circle back. How would you describe your research interests when you first started your career and how they've changed?
I first started, I think what I was trying to do initially was to demonstrate that the computer tools, because we were really at the forefront of a lot of these things that you all take for granted at this point. But we were initially trying to get through this and trying to show that there were differences in the ways in which children interfaced with this and interacted with this. I started off with my special ed populations because those are the ones at hand. You tend to go with a convenient sample, so it was like these were the kids who were convenient, so we'll work with them. But what I did was I also started trying to look at what we were doing in actual practice with preparation of educators, both in-service educators, and because they were in the same boat at the same time, they were also trying to learn this stuff. I remember one of my workshops that I did, I came in, I schlepped all the stuff in, the data projector, schlepped in the data projector and schlepped in the luggable and hooked it all up, got everything running, and I put up my PowerPoint slide and, hey, welcome to all, learned who they all were, and and then hit the arrow button, and the next slide came up, and I started to talk about what we were going to be doing in this workshop, and they went, wait, and I said, what? What did you just do? They had never seen PowerPoint, they had no idea what I had in terms of all this stuff, and so I had to take about 10 minutes out of my workshop just to explain. That wasn't the purpose of this workshop. I had to explain what it was. And then they wanted more of that. So it was like, okay. So when I first started off, we were teaching people to word process. We were teaching, adult teachers to word process, to use spreadsheets, to how to build databases. We were building PowerPoints and, teaching them how to do this. This is stuff we teach kids to do now. But at the time, even the educators didn't have it. So it opened up a whole world of possibilities, and a lot of my early work is done in how do you work with educators, both pre-service and in-service educators, to learn to use these things, and not only learn to use these things, but to change the learning environment at the same time, which is really what I wanted to do. But it's hard because that's a major mental step. To go from, I can put together a PowerPoint and use it to show my kids, to, I'm going to have my kids use PowerPoint in this creatively different way. And moving them from there over, that was a lot of my early work. And it's the same with online learning, or when we started in distance ed, taking them from where they were to rethinking and re-engaging them in a different type of thinking on how you engage your learners at this level. When we first, in Iowa, was one of the first states who had a major statewide fiber optic network, and they had 800, now they have about 800 video classrooms. And when we first started, we were teaching the teachers how to use these major video classrooms, and they were beautifully done. I mean, they were really well organized. Multiple cameras, a computer interface control panel for it, lots of resources right at their fingertips, and so on. Interestingly enough, when we were training them to use this, I mean, it takes you about, maybe 10 minutes to train them how to use all the parts. Because it's not only intuitive, but it says, teacher camera, student camera, overhead camera. Okay, duh. You can read, you can push the right button, and there you are. So it takes you just a few minutes to learn to use the appropriate different buttons on this screen. But what we had to do was get them to understand that you couldn't just be the talking head. So how do you take good classroom practice that you engage in face-to-face all the time? How do you take good classroom practice and translate it into this tool or into this resource that you're not comfortable with? So getting them to think about how do you create interactivity between multiple sites? How do you create interactivity in ways of getting the learners to be in multiple sites or different sites and still work collectively together as groups? And a lot of our early work that I did, I worked very closely with a gal who's still at Northern Iowa. We actually spent a lot of time doing workshops and writing about creating interactivity and creating that kind of learning environment that is best practice in this world that's totally mediated. And so how do you transition over? And then at that point, we were also starting to look at online learning and how do you create those kinds of interactivities? How do you create those kinds of learning experiences in this mediated world that's, for all intents and purposes, not a world that everybody is comfortable in? So that's kind of how I evolved from what I was doing with the computer stuff to evolving into my online work. And really, it's all still the same stuff, because it's how do you use these resources to reinvent learning opportunities? How do you take these things and make it possible for learning to occur? And so that's sort of been my history in terms of my research and how it's evolved. And actually right now, my current piece is looking at a lot of us who are sort of, I don't want to call us pioneers, I guess I could call myself a pioneer. A lot of us who've worked in this long enough and are very comfortable with this are people who are also designing our own instructions. So we're really designer instructors or instructor designers. But we have both worlds. We have the instructional design world in our repertoire of our thinking, and we also have the educational world in our repertoire of thinking. But there are people out there who are designing online learning who have their content and their potentially good instructional practice. They don't have the design world as part of their thinking. So I'm really starting to look at the instructor designer who is not a designer, the non-designer instructor designer, and what kinds of thinking they're going through. Or are there things we need to be doing to facilitate that process, to getting them thinking about these same things we think about as we intuitively do as members of the field? So it's kind of looking at it from a different perspective, but it's still creating quality online learning experiences, but outside my venue of IT or any kind of schooling stuff. So.
Definitely a lot of bridges.
Yeah, there's lots of places you can go with this. I think that's the part that makes it so much fun.
Yeah, it's exciting.
You can't get bored with this field. That's the one thing I did learn very early on.
Sounds like you've taken that. What were some of the major ideas or approaches that stimulated your professional growth?
Oh golly. I think probably for me, one area or one thing was just learning about this thing called instructional design. It had never really been given to me in that sense, never understanding all of the nuances and the layers and the levels of your thinking within the context of designing instruction. I always just wrote lesson plans and did what I did, and I had a couple of methods courses, so I kind of knew how to teach a little of this and a little of that and a little something else. And there's a deeper layer of thinking, and it was that whole instructional design stuff that I really began to understand now what I didn't know before. The other one was, as part of my dissertation work, I got into looking at, really delving into the learner and looking very specifically at learners and looking at how you understand the learners and what are some of the characteristics that the learners bring to the table. And I was working with adults as part of my dissertation, so looking at it, what do adults bring to the table in terms of their own preconceived notions, their own approaches to problems that you're asking them to solve. What are the things that I need to know about them? So I got really, really very fascinated by all the learner research that was being done. And looking at the way in which then that took me back to my special ed days, where I went, well, yeah, some of these kids would handle it this way, and some of these kids would handle it that way. Well, duh. Now I understand it, but I didn't understand it at that point. So I think that was one of the major things that, as I got into this field, that was one of the major things that really started to move me forward. The other one was looking at the medium itself, looking at the media, and looking at these things. And how do we construct the environment? How do we deal with, and that was a lot of the early work of Bob Hynek and Mike Melinda and Jim Russell, who I actually ended up working with in terms of their book. But it became one of those things as I looked at this, they really were not talking so much about the actual tools as much as they were, how do you create the venue to make it possible for the learner to take the learning experience and actually make it meaningful for them. And so that became an important aspect of what I was learning too. So between looking at the learner themselves, but also looking at how the medium can in fact influence the way the learner interfaces with information was also important for me. And so out of that, I think I've grown into more of who I am today, I think.
Thank you for sharing. What were some of the most important trends in the field during your career?
Well, as I said, I started off before we all had desktops. I started off before actually the first 2 years I taught the Ed Media course, I had to teach the kids how to thread the 16mm projector and how to flip a slide over in the slide tray so that the slide was right side up and not best upward. That's very embarrassing. I actually started off looking at how do you use the overhead projector in constructive and creative ways. I mean, I was teaching kids how to teach with an overhead projector. I was teaching with an overhead projector. So a lot of the stuff that you take in naturally now wasn't around then. Or if it was around, it was not something that we could afford. In schools of education, they tended to be in engineering schools, or they tended to be in the high science areas, or computer science areas. They weren't in schools, they weren't in colleges of education. So we didn't have a lot of that fun stuff. And it wasn't until I actually was in the business of teacher education that we actually started getting some of those fun tools and some of those fun things. I started teaching Logo. And I started teaching HyperCard and some of those other earlier languages. One of my first experiences, and the big chuckle on this one is my current university president was one of the people who was at the University of Illinois at the time. I was using tutor language, which was part of the old Plato system. Okay, that's long before your time. And they had a plasma screen interface. It was a touchscreen interface. It was really very, very basic. But they used a special language called Tutor. It's the only programming book I ever kept. Ironically, my current university president was one of those graduate students on the back side of the machinery, so to speak. He was one of those who was working on designing the code for Tutor. And when he mentioned that, I just about fell off the chair laughing, because I was probably the only person in the room who knew what he was talking about. So he was coding Tutor, I was trying to use Tutor. It was just one of those, it was another one of those programming languages I learned. But I learned a lot about, in the process, one of the things I learned was never get comfortable with any of it, because tomorrow's a whole new day, and a whole new thing is going to come down the pike, and a whole new way of doing things with these tools is going to happen. So you have to build into what you're doing, no matter who you are and no matter where you are. You have to build flexibility into your thinking constantly. But the underlying piece is learning is learning. Learning is there. We still haven't solved all the questions we have with regard to it, but the ultimate fundamental thing that we're looking at is improving learning experiences. So I think that's kind of where I was going with that question. But
who are some of the people who have had the most impact on your professional growth?
Well, I never met some of these people, or I've met them in very brief ways. But then there are others who I have. I think I have two genres of people. I think early on it was Leslie Briggs and Robert Gagne, because that was the school of thought that I was working on in terms of my ID background. They were the ones who were presented to me as being the experts. Walter Dick was another one. I met him years later, and it was like, oh, you're Walter Dick. I would never have picked him out of a crowd, because he wasn't who I thought he was. I mean, I had these sort of pinnacle views of these people. But those were early on. They were books that I read. Those were the people's materials that I read. Those were the sort of the authority figures at that point when I started. But as I evolved along, I ran into people like Mike Hannafin and Charlie Regaluth, David Jonasson, others in that same era of people who are doing fantastically amazing things with this field that I hadn't thought about. So I moved from sort of the old classics into sort of the modernists, as it were, in terms of the field. And I think in some ways they were also very influential in my thinking about what are some of my thoughts. I love some of the work that David was doing, in particular with regard to looking at problem solving in complex, simple to complex problems. And how do you develop problems for children to solve, use and have them interface with the tools and the technologies as resources that they can use. So basically moving them into learning, but moving them into learning by giving them problems as the way of approaching the learning. And that was a major aha moment for me in terms of I changed my style of teaching at that point. So instead of telling people about stuff, I started creating scenarios for them and presenting situations for them that they then had to delve into the work and into the information to be able to solve that problem. And so my whole way of approaching teaching changed because of some of that work. I think there are, I just went to a very interesting session with a young man who kept talking about his dissertation, and he's a newbie in the field, so to speak. And a lot of what he was saying, it was like, well, that's very interesting, and I should make a mental note to myself to go and look more at his work, but also to kind of delve a little bit deeper into some of the references and the resources he was using, because it was a good curiosity. So I think it's all along the continuum of, the classics, some of the people who I would like to call contemporaries, hopefully they would call me a contemporary. And then I think there's the new people out there who are doing some really neat, good stuff that I think is also very important. And I think my students have also been very important to me in terms of influencing me to think. Not just my doc students, but even my master students, the teachers I work with, but also the undergraduate students. Because they ask me the why would I want to do that question. And it's like, well, that's a very good question. Because I said so isn't sufficient. Used to be, but it isn't anymore. So it's getting to understand that one of the beauties of this field, but one of the things that I like most about what I do is I seem to be able to move around within all of the people in the field and be able to have, I find snippets of what everybody has been a factor in terms of my thinking.
What do you think was the greatest accomplishment of your career and why?
I kept looking at that question. You sent me these questions before. I kept looking at that question going, I don't know. I don't honestly know if I've had a greatest accomplishment. I'm sure people would say, oh, you've done this and you've done this. And in fact, when I got invited to be part of this video sequence, I said to Barbara, I really don't know why you would be asking me. And her comment was, and she started ticking off all these things. I think, among other things, I've been able to perhaps provide some leadership to the association. I am a past president. It's something to be proud of. I think I've done some things within my writing. The couple of textbooks that are out there have been, I think, important, particularly the Instructional Technology and Media for Learning book is one that I think has evolved since I joined the writing team, but it's also a book that when I meet undergraduates or I meet graduate students who go, oh yeah, I used that book when I think it's a book that has influenced them in some ways. So, and perhaps I've influenced teacher education a little, but I think probably my greatest accomplishment as I watch them walk around and have professorial positions and present and write are my students. Because I've somehow been able to touch a little bit of them in a way that's made them be able to move forward in their own careers and been able to become important in their own venue. And I think that that's an important aspect of, I think probably if I had to pick an accomplishment, I think it's my students. I hope it's my students.
How do you want to be remembered within this profession?
You know, that was the other question I kept going. You know, it's kind of an interesting puzzle. I would like, and this makes you feel like, you know, you're old and gray and you're in the nursing home or even past that point, and people are, oh yeah, I remember her. She was the lady who was, you know. I think what I would like most for people to remember in terms of things that I've tried to contribute is that I've tried to get people to think about what it is that we are doing and how can we do them differently, because what we're doing is what we used to do. I don't want to think about today. I don't even want to think about tomorrow. I want to think, where are we going to be 10 years from now or 20 years from now in terms of education? When I'm working with undergraduates, I don't want to think about them in terms of this semester or when you go out to student teach in 2 semesters from now. I would like to be remembered as someone who's trying to get people to think differently. Out of the box is always what they say, but really not, you can still be in the box, but thinking it differently. I think if you look at the classroom, if you look at it from the perspective of, this is the entity I work in, how can I work in this entity differently so that the children or the students who are in this entity, in this box, come out better as a result of it. Not just knowing the stuff that I'm trying to stuff into their heads, but actually thinking better about how to continue to think about the stuff. So it's not ending the course, closing the book, taking it back to the bookstore. It's getting to the end of the class and going, wow, I have a whole lot more I need to think about. And I need to think about it in the context of this and this and this. And I need to rethink these things as I rethink this stuff too. So I guess I would like to be remembered as someone who has tried to prompt people to rethink what we do, both as and within our own profession, but as a grander whole of how do we rethink what we do in education. And I don't know if I'll be remembered for that or just being the craggy old lady who shows up periodically and goes, I don't know about that. No, I honestly think I would like to, I've always wanted to revolutionize education. I don't think I'll be known as the revolutionary in education, but I think I've tried to make others think about how they can change. And I guess that's more important to me.
Is there something I haven't asked that you'd like to share?
I think what we need to do as a profession is stop being so damn serious about ourselves. I think we need to really stop dwelling on the seriousness of it and learn how to have fun with it. When I first started working with these computers, I had fun, and my kids and I had fun. I got so that I was like, every day was a new exciting adventure. I'm not a gamer. I was playing games with the kids because I was trying to figure out what kinds of things you could do with this. I was trying to always explore it and change it and do things and use it in different ways. One day I had my superintendent and a bunch of visitors were walking through the building, and I had the computer lab of 2 computers in the back of my classroom at that point. And one of the kids was back there and he was playing Frogger, and he was trying to get this little thingy across this highway, with all these obstacles and and so you have to try over again. And you'd earn points if you could jump over things or if you get past things, and you kept earning these little points. And the principal came, or the superintendent came up and he goes, "You got the kids playing games?" I said, "Ask him." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Ask him what the objective is." I used to play poker with the kids a lot too, back in my speech therapy days. I used to play poker a lot with the kids. 5-card draw. And one day, principal came in and she looked at me and I said, "We're working on articulation." And she said, "Okay." And we had to bet. But the betting was in specific to that particular child's speech problem. So the child with the S problem could only bet certain amounts or certain kinds of things that dealt with S words that began with the S sound. I had another one with an R problem, and he could only bet with words that began with the R sound. And so we were working on our specific sounds, but we were playing poker. Now, I'm sure the parents weren't really thrilled that I was teaching them 5-card draw, but it engaged the kids in this experience, and I had fun. To me, speech therapy was the most boring thing anyone could do. No offense to SLPs, but to me it was the most boring thing if we're sitting there going, okay, read down the list. Si, sun, su. That's not fun, and it doesn't make it fun for the kids, and it certainly wasn't making it fun for me. To be able to take something and just have fun with it and play with it. And I think we take ourselves too seriously. I think we need to learn to have fun. And I think we need to learn how to take that fun and to use it in meaningful ways. And I don't know if you asked me that question before or not, but I felt like I needed to say that.
Excellent. Well,
Thank you.
Love the answer. I don't have any more questions. Thank you so much for sharing today.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you for the invitation.